There's a photograph from 1938. A young Chinese boy sits in the ruins of Shanghai's South Railway Station, crying. Around him, the devastation of war. Above him, the shadow of a future superpower. But here's what most people don't know about that photograph. It was distributed globally by something called the Information Department of the China Defense Supplies Corporation. And who ran that? An Englishman named William Henry Donald, working for Madame Chiang Kai-shek, whose government was being advised by dozens of British officials, fighting a war with weapons bought through British banks, communicated through British cables, and photographed by British cameramen. That image traveled the world on British ships, through British telegraph lines, was printed in newspapers owned or influenced by British media moguls, and shaped public opinion in ways that would determine the course of World War II. Yet today, if you ask someone about the British Empire in 1938, they'll probably think of dusty colonies and fading glory. They won't think of the invisible architecture of global power that made that crying boy's image a weapon of propaganda more effective than any bomb. The British Empire didn't just conquer territory, it built the operating system of the modern world. Then somehow it convinced everyone, including the British themselves, that it had nothing to do with it. Let me show you what I mean. Pull out your phone right now. Check the time. Why is it exactly the time it says it is? Because in 1884, representatives from 25 nations met in Washington, D.C., and agreed that the prime meridian, the 0 point from which all time on Earth is measured, would pass through Greenwich, England. A British suburb became the center of space and time itself. Not Paris, despite French protests. Not Washington, despite American power. Greenwich. The British didn't argue for it particularly hard because by 1884 it was already a fait accompli. Two-thirds of all ships in the world were already using charts based on Greenwich. The British hadn't just mapped the world, they'd convinced everyone else to use their map. This wasn't about flags and anthems. This was about something far more profound and far more lasting. The British created the infrastructure of thought itself for the modern age. Consider the internet. Everyone knows Americans invented it, right? Through ARPANET and Silicon Valley innovation. But why does the internet work the way it does? Why can someone in Tokyo communicate seamlessly with someone in Buenos Aires? Because in 1865, the British laid the first successful transatlantic telegraph cable. Then they laid another 27. Then they connected India, then Singapore, then Australia, then South Africa. By 1900, the British controlled over 65% of the world's cable network. They didn't just connect the British Empire, they connected the world to itself, and they did it on their terms, with their technology, following their protocols. When the internet emerged in the late 20th century, it didn't invent global communication. It digitized a network architecture that the British had created with copper wire a century before. The same routes, often the same landing points, the same choke points. The British cable from Singapore to Australia, laid in 1871, follows almost exactly the same route as modern fiber optic cables, because the British had already figured out the optimal paths. But here's where it gets truly strange. Ask a British person today about their country's role in creating modern communications, and you'll get a blank stare. Maybe a vague mention of Marconi and radio, even though Marconi was Italian. The collective amnesia is so complete that when historians point out that the British invented international communication infrastructure, people react with surprise. Really? I thought Americans did that. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we excavate the forgotten foundations of our present. If you're enjoying this journey into historical amnesia, consider leaving a super thanks. It helps us keep digging into these stories that everyone somehow forgot. And quick question for you, what time are you watching this? Morning coffee? Late night rabbit hole? And where in the world are you? Drop your country and time in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how far this particular piece of British infrastructure has carried this video. Now, let's talk about money. Not the physical stuff, the concept. In 1694, England was a middling power recovering from a costly war with France. The government was broke. Traditional methods of raising funds, selling offices, debasing currency, Begging from goldsmiths had been exhausted. So a group of merchants proposed something revolutionary. They would lend the government $1.2 million at 8% interest, and in exchange, they would receive a charter to establish the Bank of England, the first true central bank. This changed everything. Before this, money was stuff. Gold, silver, commodities. After this, money became a promise. A promise backed not by metal in a vault, but by the productive capacity of an entire nation and eventually an empire. The Bank of England didn't just manage currency. It invented the modern concept of public credit, the notion that a government could borrow against its future revenue, that debt wasn't just acceptable but could be productive, that financial instruments could be trusted and traded. Within a century, Britain had used this innovation to outborrow and outspend every rival. While France struggled with tax farming and corrupt financiers, Britain built a fiscal military state of unprecedented efficiency. By 1815, after defeating Napoleon, Britain held about 70% of the world's government debt. They hadn't just won a military victory, they'd won an economic paradigm shift. And here's the thing. This British invention became the global standard. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, was explicitly modeled on the Bank of England. So was Germany's Reichsbank, Japan's Bank of Japan, the central banks of India, Australia, Canada, South Africa. Even the People's Bank of China, established by the Chinese Communist Party in 1948, operates on principles pioneered by the Bank of England. The idea that a central institution should manage national currency, set interest rates, act as lender of last resort, control inflation, it all traces back to that 1694 innovation in London. Today, when the Federal Reserve adjusts interest rates and the entire global economy holds its breath, it's following a script written by British merchants 330 years ago. Yet, if you ask most people who invented modern banking, they'll say the Jews based on medieval stereotypes, or the Italians based on Renaissance Florence, or the Americans based on contemporary power. The British, despite literally inventing the architecture of modern finance, have somehow been written out of their own story. Why? How does the empire that built modernity get erased from the narrative of modernity? Let's go deeper. Look at your clothes right now. There's probably a label inside telling you where it was made. Bangladesh, Vietnam, China, somewhere where labor is cheap and production is efficient. That label exists because of something called the country of origin marking, which became internationally standardized in the late 19th century. And why did that become standard? Because British manufacturers wanted to protect their reputation. They pushed for laws requiring foreign goods, especially cheap German knockoffs, to be clearly labeled. The Merchandise Marks Act of 1887 required goods imported to Britain to show their country of origin. This backfired spectacularly. German manufacturers, instead of being shamed, leaned into it. Made in Germany became a mark of quality that rivaled Made in Britain, but the system stuck. Today, every item traded internationally carries a legacy of that British attempt at commercial protectionism. The World Trade Organization still uses country of origin rules descended from Victorian British trade law. You want more? Let's talk about football. And I mean soccer, though the fact that Americans even need to specify soccer is itself a British legacy. Americans called it soccer because that's what the British called it at elite universities, association football, shortened to ASOC, then soccer. When the British working class made the game their own, they dropped the upper class term and reclaimed football. Americans using the British upper class terminology now get mocked by modern Brits for not calling it football, even though soccer is the more historically accurate British term. But forget the name. The game itself. The rules were codified in 1863 by the Football Association in London. Those rules spread through the British Empire, through British merchants, through British sailors in port cities from Buenos Aires to Bangkok. Today, FIFA has 211 member associations, more than the United Nations. The world's most popular sport, watched by billions, played by children in every country on Earth, is organized according to rules written in a London pub in 1863. The World Cup, the single largest sporting event in human history, is essentially a celebration of Victorian British leisure culture, exported globally and then forgotten as British. Argentina and Brazil have won multiple World Cups and have football cultures that dwarf England's in passion and skill. Yet they're playing a game whose fundamental rules, whose very structure, whose global organization came from England. And somehow England gets treated as just another participant, not as the architect of the entire system. Railways. Here's a fact that should be taught in every school but isn't. In 1900, India had the fourth largest railway network in the world, over 25,000 miles of track. All of it built by the British, primarily to extract resources and move troops. Today, India has one of the largest railway networks on Earth, and it's still largely based on that British infrastructure. The broad gauge of 5 feet 6 inches, was decided by British engineers in the 1850s. That decision, made by men who've been dead for over a century, still determines how billions of people travel in India today. But it's bigger than India. The British built railways in Argentina, in China, in East Africa, in the Ottoman Empire. They exported not just the technology, but the entire concept of scheduled, mechanized mass transit. Before British railways, most people never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. After British railways, human mobility became routine. The British standardized track gauges, signaling systems, safety protocols, organizational hierarchies. When Japan built its first railway in 1872, British engineers designed it. When Argentina built its massive rail network, British capital and British engineers built it. When the Trans-Siberian Railway was constructed, the Russians hired British consultants. The very idea that nations should be connected by iron rails, that train schedules should be published and reliable, that different railway companies should use compatible systems. All of this emerged from British innovation and was spread by British power. And today, Britain's railways are often mocked as inefficient and outdated. The Japanese Shinkansen, the French TGV, even American freight rail are considered superior. The student has surpassed the master so completely that people forget there was a master. The global railway system, one of the foundations of modern civilization, is British in origin. Yet Britain receives no credit for inventing the very concept of the networked industrial world. Let's talk about something more abstract. The weekend. Why do you not work on Saturday and Sunday? In most of human history, there was no weekend. There were holy days, yes. There were rest days. But the idea of a standardized 2-day period of rest for all workers, regardless of religion or occupation, that's an innovation. And it came from Britain. The Factory Act of 1850 limited the working week in textile factories to 10 hours a day, Monday through Friday, and 8 hours on Saturday. By the 1870s, British workers were pushing for Saint Monday, taking Mondays off to recover from weekend drinking. Employers seeking efficiency compromised. They created the English week, working Monday through Friday and half of Saturday, giving Sunday fully off. By the early 20th century, this had evolved into the full 2-day weekend. This pattern spread through the British Empire, then to industrializing nations that copied British labor practices. The Soviet Union tried to create a different system, with rotating rest days, but abandoned it in favor of the British weekend model. Today, billions of people organize their lives around a pattern of work and rest invented by British industrial capitalism. Friday means something specific. Sunday means something specific because of decisions made in Manchester and Birmingham 150 years ago. Yet, if you ask people where the weekend comes from, they shrug. It seems natural, obvious, eternal. The fact that it's a specific historical innovation, created in a specific place at a specific time, has been completely forgotten. Here's where it gets even weirder. The English language. Obviously, everyone knows English is widespread because of British imperialism and then American cultural dominance. But what people don't realize is the specific way the British engineered English as a global language. In 1858, the British government took direct control of India from the East India Company. One of their first major decisions was about education. They could have left Indians to learn in their own languages. Instead, they implemented Macaulay's infamous policy, creating a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. English language education became the path to advancement in colonial India. The British did this everywhere, in Egypt, in Malaya, in Nigeria, in the Caribbean. They created English language schools, English language universities, English language administration. They made English the language of law, of commerce, of prestige. But here's the crucial part. They didn't just teach vocabulary and grammar, they taught an entire epistemological framework. They taught categories of thought, legal concepts, scientific methodologies, bureaucratic procedures, all in English, all based on English models. So when these colonies became independent, they didn't just abandon English, they couldn't. Their entire educated class, their entire administrative apparatus, their entire legal system thought in English. India's Supreme Court operates in English, the legal code is in English. Higher education is largely in English. Not because Indians today are being forced by British imperialists, but because the infrastructure of Indian modernity was built in English, and rebuilding it in Hindi or Tamil would be like trying to rewire a computer while it's running. This is true across the former British Empire. Nigeria has over 500 languages, but English is the official language because it's the only one that doesn't favor one ethnic group over another, and because the entire structure of Nigerian law and government was built in English. Kenya, Singapore, Ghana, Pakistan all operate in English, not primarily because of American cultural influence, but because the British built their modern states in English. And here's the amnesia. When people talk about global English today, they attribute it to Hollywood, to Microsoft, to American economic power. The British role, the foundation upon which American cultural hegemony built itself, gets minimized or ignored. It's like crediting the paint job while ignoring the foundation. Okay, let's talk about something that will blow your mind. International law. The entire concept. Before the British Empire, there were treaties, sure, agreements between monarchs, peace settlements, commercial arrangements. But the idea of a universal law of nations, applicable everywhere, enforceable through international mechanisms, that's a British invention. It emerged from the British need to manage their empire and their maritime dominance. The British couldn't have soldiers everywhere, so they needed rules that would be respected without constant enforcement. They pioneered concepts like freedom of navigation, neutrality in wartime, consular protections, extradition treaties, and crucially, the idea that certain legal principles applied universally regardless of local custom. British legal theorists like Jeremy Bentham coined the very term international law in 1789. British jurists like James Lorimer and William Edward Hall wrote the foundational texts of international law in the 19th century. British diplomatic practice, British court decisions, British treaty making created precedents that became the basis for modern international law. The Geneva Conventions, built on protocols pioneered by the British. The International Court of Justice, modeled largely on British legal practice. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted significantly by British lawyers. The entire concept that nations can be held accountable to shared standards, that war has rules, that diplomacy follows protocols, all of this emerged from the British attempt to create a legal framework for their global empire. And today, international law exists primarily to constrain powerful nations, including Britain. The system the British created to legitimize their empire is now used to prosecute British soldiers for war crimes in Iraq. The irony is extraordinary, and it's completely invisible to most people, who assume international law has always existed or was created by the United Nations in 1945. Let me give you something really specific. Passports. The modern passport was invented by the British during World War I. Before that, most people didn't need documents to travel internationally, you just showed up. But in 1914, the British government needed to control movement during wartime, so they created the British passport, a standardized document with a photograph, personal details, and government endorsement. After the war, other countries adopted the British model. The League of Nations in 1920 held a conference on passports and recommended that all countries use a similar format, based on the British design. Today, your passport, regardless of which country issued it, follows specifications that descended from that British innovation. The size, the photo, the data fields, the machine-readable zone, all of it traces back to British bureaucratic innovation. This is what I mean by the invisible infrastructure. You don't think about your passport as a British invention. It seems neutral, universal, obvious. But it's not. It's a specific tool, created at a specific time for specific reasons, that became universal because British power made it universal. Sports again. Tennis. Modern tennis was invented by a British Army officer named Walter Clopton Wingfield in 1873. He patented it, marketed it, and it spread through British social networks. Wimbledon, established in 1877, became the premier championship. Today, tennis is global, but the 4 Grand Slam tournaments include Wimbledon, still considered the most prestigious. The All England Club, a private club in London, sets standards that the entire tennis world respects. A British invention governed by British institutions, yet seen as universal. Cricket is even more extreme. A game invented in England, spread through the British Empire, and then forgotten by almost everyone except former British colonies. India, Pakistan, Australia, the West Indies, South Africa, they've made cricket their own. But they're playing a game whose laws, whose terminology, whose very spirit are English. The Marylebone Cricket Club in London, founded in 1787, is still the guardian of the laws of cricket, not the International Cricket Council, not a democratic body, a private club in London that has appointed itself the keeper of cricket's laws, and the world accepts it because of institutional inertia from empire. I want to talk about mapping for a second. Not just the Greenwich Meridian, but the entire concept of modern cartography. The British Ordnance Survey, established in 1791, pioneered the idea of comprehensive, standardized, scientifically accurate mapping of an entire nation. They created consistent scales, standardized symbols, elevation markings, coordinate systems. This wasn't decorative, it was the foundation of modern infrastructure planning. The British exported this to their empire. The Survey of India, established in 1767, eventually employed thousands of people to map the entire subcontinent. The mapping of Africa, the scramble for Africa, was literally British cartographers racing to map territory before other European powers could claim it. The famous Sykes-Picot Agreement that divided the Middle East? That required British maps, British geographic knowledge, British surveying expertise. Today, when we use GPS, when we use Google Maps, we're using digital versions of cartographic principles invented by the British. The idea that space can be precisely measured, divided, mapped, and represented in standardized formats, that's not universal. It's a specific way of seeing the world that emerged from British military and imperial needs. And nobody thinks about it. Mapping seems neutral, but it's not. The choice of what to include, what to emphasize, how to represent terrain, these are all choices made by someone. And the foundational choices were made by the British. Let's talk about sports one more time, because I want to hammer this home. Rugby, modern boxing, modern swimming competitions, badminton, squash, table tennis, field hockey, all invented or codified in Britain. The Olympics were revived by a Frenchman, but most of the sports in the Olympics were standardized in Britain. Track and field events? British. Rowing? British. Sailing? British. The very concept of standardized rules for sport, of international competitions, of amateur versus professional distinctions, of fair play, all emerged from Victorian British culture. And then these sports went global, and the British contribution got buried. Football is the perfect example. England didn't win a World Cup until 1966. They've won once, Brazil has won 5 times. Yet England, specifically the Football Association, still holds disproportionate influence in FIFA. Why? Institutional inertia. They wrote the original rules so they get permanent respect, even as their actual performance declined. This happens again and again. The British create a system, the system goes global, other nations become better at the system than the British, and eventually everyone forgets who created the system in the first place. Now, let me tell you about something that's going to seem completely random: the QWERTY keyboard. The layout of letters on your keyboard, on your phone, on every digital device you own. Where did it come from? It was designed by Christopher Sholes, an American, in 1873 to prevent mechanical typewriter keys from jamming. But why did it become the global standard? Because Remington, an American company, mass-produced typewriters with QWERTY keyboards. And who bought those typewriters in massive quantities, spreading them globally? The British Empire, British colonial administrations, British businesses operating worldwide, British telegraph operators, all standardized on QWERTY keyboards. When other countries industrialized and needed typewriters, they adopted the system that the British had already made standard. There are more efficient keyboard layouts: Dvorak, Colmac, various national layouts. But we're stuck with QWERTY because British purchasing power in the late 19th century locked us into a suboptimal standard. And nobody realizes it because, again, the British role in standardizing global systems has been completely erased. Let me give you something really subtle: the concept of standard time zones. We talked about the prime meridian earlier, but time zones themselves are a British innovation. Before railways, every town kept its own time based on the sun, but British railways needed coordination. In 1840, the Great Western Railway adopted railway time, based on Greenwich. By 1847, most British railways had done the same. In 1880, the British government made Greenwich Mean Time the official legal time for all of Britain. This system spread globally. By 1900, most of the world was divided into time zones based on the Greenwich meridian. Think about what this means. The entire world, including China with its single time zone, including the United States with its multiple zones, organizes time based on a system created to coordinate British trains. Time itself, how we collectively experience and organize time, is a British colonial legacy. And it's invisible. When you check your watch, when you schedule a Zoom call across time zones, when you talk about Eastern Standard Time or Indian Standard Time, you're participating in a system created in Victorian Britain. But nobody thinks about it because it seems natural. Here's another one: the three-piece suit. Why do businessmen, politicians, professionals all over the world wear jackets, waistcoats, and trousers? Because in the early 19th century, British aristocrats and merchants established this as the uniform of respectability. Beau Brummel, a British dandy, pioneered the idea of understated, perfectly tailored clothing as a marker of status, replacing the elaborate costumes of the 18th century. This became the global business uniform. Japanese salarymen wear it, Indian bureaucrats wear it, Nigerian politicians wear it. Even when cultures have strong traditional dress, the suit is what you wear for international business, for diplomacy, for formal occasions. A specifically British fashion reflecting British values of restraint and conformity became the global standard of professional appearance. And it's so normalized that people think of it as just formal wear, not as British cultural imperialism. Kenyatta wore suits. Mandela wore suits. Gandhi rejected suits as a political statement precisely because he recognized them as symbols of British authority. But after independence, every major political leader went back to suits because the global system demands it. Let's talk about tea. Here's something wild. Tea is associated with British culture, with British identity. A nice cup of tea is stereotypically British, but tea is from China. The British didn't invent it, didn't discover it, didn't even introduce it to Europe. The Dutch did that.